debt was owed. A life was the price, and a woman stood on a block, her future waiting for the fall of a hammer. This wasn't a story about a crime being paid, but about a promise being broken, and another stranger promise being kept. It was a story about a woman who was sold to cover her father's sins, until a lone black cowboy looked at the chaos and said quietly, "I'll take her home." Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun was a hammer, and the dusty square of Redemption, Arizona was the anvil. Ilara felt it beating down on her head, through the thin cotton of her dress, a relentless punishment that promised no relief. She stood on a makeshift platform, 3 wooden crates nailed together, the splintered edges digging into the soles of her worn shoes. Below her, a sea of faces swam in the heat haze, faces that were grim, faces that were curious, faces that were hungry. They were her neighbors, the people she had offered a polite nod to in the general store, the families she had seen in church on Sundays. Now they looked at her as if she were a piece of livestock, a curiosity to be appraised and possessed. Shame was a physical thing, a hot liquid that filled her throat and threatened to spill from her eyes. But beneath the shame was a harder, colder core of fury. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. The auctioneer, a man whose sweat stains mapped his desperation, cleared his throat and began his wretched sermon. "We are gathered here," he bellowed, his voice cracking, "to see a debt paid. A debt of honor, a debt of trust, a debt owed to the good people of this town by the scoundrel Thomas Vance." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Her father's name, a name that was once respected, now spat out like poison. The auctioneer didn't detail the crime. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. The failed investments, the borrowed funds that vanished, the promises that had turned to dust, taking the town's meager savings with them. "And since the coward has fled," the auctioneer continued, gesturing toward Ilara with a theatrical flourish, "his debt falls upon his only asset, his daughter, Ilara." He began to list her qualities as if she were a mare. Strong, healthy, educated, can read and write and do sums, fit for housework, fieldwork, or other duties. The insinuation hung in the thick air, a foul stench. Ilara stared at a single point on the horizon, a crack in the blue facade of the sky, and focused on a memory. Her father, his hands smelling of sawdust and pipe tobacco, holding her own small hands in his. "I will always protect you, Ilara," he had said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "No harm will ever come to you while I draw breath." The irony was a blade twisting in her gut. She was here because he drew breath somewhere else, somewhere far from the consequences of his actions. The bidding began, a chorus of insults. $5, a grimy farmer shouted. "For the dress, maybe," another jeered, followed by coarse laughter. She felt herself shrinking, dissociating from the body that stood on the block. She was becoming a thing, an object of scorn and barter, her life's value measured in single-digit insults. The price crawled upward, driven more by spite than actual worth. It was a performance of communal vengeance, and she was the effigy. The bidding stalled at $40, a sum both insulting and ruinous. The man who held the final offer was a saloon owner named Grice, a portly figure with small, wet eyes that had lingered on her for years. He licked his lips, a grotesque pantomime of satisfaction. The auctioneer raised his gavel, the sound of its movement unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. $40 once, $40 twice. Ilara closed her eyes, bracing for the final damning blow. This was it. This was the end of her life as she knew it, the beginning of a nightmare from which she would likely never wake. But the blow never landed. Instead, a new voice cut through the tense air, calm and clear, yet carrying the weight of iron. $100. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Heads swiveled, searching for the source. Ilara's eyes snapped open. He stood at the back of the crowd, partially obscured by the shadow of the blacksmith shop. He was a black man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the simple, durable clothes of a working cowboy. His hat was pulled low, but it couldn't hide the resolute line of his jaw or the stillness of his presence. He was an island of quiet in the churning sea of the mob. The townspeople stared, their shock quickly curdling into suspicion and resentment. The auctioneer squinted, flustered. "100, you say?" The stranger took a slow step forward, emerging from the shadows. The sun caught the dust on his boots, the worn leather of his gun belt. He didn't repeat the number. Instead, he met the auctioneer's gaze and said two words that changed everything. "I'll pay." He moved with an unhurried grace, parting the stunned crowd as if they were reeds in a river. He walked directly to the auctioneer's table and, without a word, upended a heavy leather pouch. Gold and silver coins spilled out, shining with a light that seemed to mock the dirty, grasping nature of the day. It was far more than $100. It was a statement. An act of finality that silenced all opposition. Ilara stared, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. Terror warred with a nascent, unfamiliar flicker of something else. Not hope, not yet, but a profound and terrifying curiosity. Who was this man? His face was a mask, his eyes holding a depth she couldn't fathom. They weren't leering like Grice's, nor were they filled with the smug judgment of the other townsfolk. They were just steady, watching her, seeing her. The transaction was completed in a stunned silence. The sheriff, a man who typically moved with the speed of molasses in winter, almost scurried to unlock the simple manacle that bound her wrist to a post on the platform. The metal fell away, and she was free, yet more captive than ever. The stranger didn't speak to her. He simply collected the empty pouch, gave a curt nod, and turned to walk away, expecting her to follow. She was his property now, bought and paid for. The journey away from redemption was a silent pilgrimage into a vast, unforgiving wilderness. Her new owner, she could not bring herself to think of him as her savior, had procured a sturdy mule for her, while he rode a powerful black horse that moved with the same quiet confidence as its master. He never looked back to see if she was following. He didn't need to. Where would she go? The town had cast her out, and the desert that stretched before them offered only a swifter, lonelier demise. So she followed the straight, unyielding line of his back, the sun beating down, the rhythmic clopping of hooves the only sound in a world that had gone utterly mute. Her mind, however, was a cacophony. Every possible scenario played out in a horrifying loop. He was taking her to a remote mining camp to be sold again. He was a monster of a different sort, one who preferred his cruelty in private. Each silent mile stretched her nerves tighter. She studied him, searching for a clue, a sign of the man beneath the stoic exterior. She noted the way his hands, calloused and strong, were gentle on the horse's reins. She saw the careful way he scanned the horizon, not like a man who was lost, but like a man who knew every rock and every shadow, who was intimately familiar with the language of the land. The landscape itself became a third character in their grim procession. Jagged red mesas clawed at the sky, their stark beauty a cruel counterpoint to her inner turmoil. The heat baked the very air she breathed, making it thin and difficult to draw. It was a land of extremes, of profound emptiness that seemed to echo the hollow space that had opened up inside her. Twice he stopped. The first time he dismounted and, without a word, handed her a canteen. The water was warm but life-giving. The second time, hours later, he offered a piece of dried meat. The gestures were so impersonal, so devoid of emotion, that they were more unsettling than any threat. It was the detached care one might show a valuable animal, not a person. This slow-burning dread was a unique form of torture. The absence of an overt attack, the lack of any demand, created a vacuum that her fear rushed to fill. What did he want? The question screamed in the silence of her mind. Late in the afternoon, her throat raw from dust and disuse, she finally found her voice. "Where are we going?" she asked, the words raspy and small in the vast emptiness. He didn't turn around. His shoulders didn't even stiffen. For a long moment she thought he hadn't heard her, or had chosen to ignore her. Then his voice came back to her on the wind, as flat and desolate as the landscape around them. Home. The word was not a comfort. It was a sentence, a destination without meaning, a place she could not imagine, offered by a man she could not comprehend. It hung in the air between them, a promise or a threat, and she was no closer to knowing which. They arrived as the sun bled its last orange and purple light across the western sky. Home, as he had called it, was a small, solitary cabin nestled at the base of a sweeping mesa. It was utterly isolated, a tiny speck of human endeavor against an immense canvas of rock and sky. But it was not a hovel. The log walls were sturdy, the stone chimney was well built, and a small fenced garden showed signs of meticulous care. A windmill turned slowly in the evening breeze, its gentle creak a lonely sound. There was a stoic dignity to the place, a sense of order carved out of the chaos of the wilderness. It was the home of a man who was accustomed to solitude, who had made peace with it, or perhaps had been defeated by it. He led the animals to a small corral, unsaddling his horse with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He did not ask for her help. He did not seem to require anything of her at all. When he was finished, he finally turned to her. His shadow was long in the twilight, stretching out to touch her feet. He gestured toward the cabin door with a slight nod of his head. "Your room is inside, to the left." His voice was the same low monotone, a voice that gave nothing away. She entered the cabin. It was dark, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and something else, a faint, clean scent like dried herbs. He followed her in and lit a kerosene lamp, chasing the deepest shadows into the corners. The main room was sparse but clean, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth. To the left was a doorway, as he'd said. Her room was little more than a closet, containing a simple cot with a neatly folded blanket, a small wash basin on a stand, and a single high window that looked out onto a wall of solid rock. It was a cell, but a clean one. He stood in the doorway of the main room, a formidable silhouette against the lamplight. It was here, in the confines of his home, that he finally laid out the terms of her existence. "You will work," he said, his words falling like stones into the silence. "There is a garden to tend, mending to be done, the cabin to be kept. You will earn your keep." He paused, letting the weight of his declaration settle. "You will not try to run. There is nothing but 100 miles of bad land in any direction. You will die before you see another soul." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Do you understand?" She could only nod, a knot of fear and exhaustion tightening in her chest. He gave a single, sharp nod in return, then turned and walked out of the cabin, closing the main door behind him, leaving her in the suffocating quiet of her new prison. She stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then her legs gave way, and she sank onto the hard cot, the facade of strength she had maintained since the auction finally shattering into a million pieces. Sobs racked her body, silent and convulsive. The flicker of curiosity she had felt on the journey was extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of her situation. She was the property of a silent, inscrutable man, a prisoner in a wilderness at the edge of the world. The word home echoed in her mind, a cruel mockery of everything she had ever known or hoped for. Days dissolved into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the silent man she now knew only as Silas. Her life became a map of chores, a litany of physical tasks that left her body aching by nightfall, but, to her surprise, also began to soothe the frantic buzzing in her mind. She pulled weeds from the surprisingly fertile soil of the garden, her fingers learning the difference between a young tomato plant and a stubborn thistle. She learned to grind corn into meal, the repetitive motion of the stone pestle a kind of meditation. She mended Silas's coarse work shirts, her needles stitching together not just fabric, but the frayed edges of her own sanity. The work was hard, a stark contrast to the life of reading and quiet domesticity she had known, but it was honest. There was a truth in the soil, a clarity in the effort required to draw life from it. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and capable. Her body, once accustomed to the confines of a small town, grew lean and strong. Silas remained a fortress of silence. He would leave at dawn, work his unseen claim or check his trap lines and return at dusk, covered in the dust and sweat of his labors. They ate their meals at the same rough-hewn table, the space between them a chasm of unspoken words. The only sounds were the scrape of cutlery on wooden plates and the sigh of the wind outside. He never looked at her with the leering hunger of the men in town, nor did he ever raise his voice or a hand to her. His presence was a constant neutral weight in her life. He was her jailer, yet he was also her protector in this harsh land. The contradiction was a constant source of turmoil. She resented him for his ownership of her, for the cold, transactional nature of her salvation. She feared the coiled power she sensed in his stillness, but a different feeling began to take root in the barren ground of her emotions, a grudging, vexing respect. He was a man of immense discipline. His tools were always clean and in their proper place. His animals were always fed before he was. He moved with a purpose that suggested a deep, internal code of conduct, however strange and impenetrable it seemed to her. She began to notice the small details of his existence, searching for cracks in his stoic facade. She saw the worn copy of a book on his bedside table, not the Bible, but something by Shakespeare. She saw him one evening, standing by the corral, speaking to his horse in a low, gentle murmur she could not quite hear, and she saw the object on the simple wooden mantelpiece above the hearth, a small, tarnished silver frame, laid face down, as if its contents were too painful or too sacred to be viewed. The mystery of Silas was no longer just a source of fear. It became a puzzle she felt compelled to solve. Who was this man who read classic literature in a wilderness cabin? Who spoke to his horse with more tenderness than he had ever shown her? And what secret did that downturned photograph hold? Her life was a prison, yes, but the nature of her jailer was becoming the central question of her confinement, a question that slowly began to overshadow her own despair. The world outside turned violent. A summer storm, born in the distant mountains, descended upon the small homestead with biblical fury. The sky, once a placid blue, became a bruised and churning ceiling of black and purple clouds. Wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, a sound like a grieving mother, and rain fell not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that hammered against the roof and walls. The deluge trapped them inside, shrinking their world to the four walls of the main room. The vast, silent spaces that had defined their coexistence were gone, replaced by a suffocating proximity. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, charged with the energy of the storm and their own repressed emotions. They had been working in a fragile, silent truce for weeks, but the storm shattered it. Ilara found herself pacing the small space, the howling wind mirroring the tempest inside her. Every fear, every resentment, every unanswered question she had swallowed for weeks began to rise in her throat like bile. She looked at Silas, who sat at the table, calmly sharpening a knife, his focus absolute, as if the apocalypse wasn't raging just beyond the door. His calm was an insult. It was a denial of her reality, of her suffering. Something inside her snapped. The carefully constructed dam of her composure burst. "Why?" The word was a raw cry, torn from her throat, loud enough to be heard over the wind. Silas's hand stilled, the knife resting on the whetstone. He looked up, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "Why did you buy me?" She pressed on, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and rage. "What do you want from me? Are you going to keep me here forever, in this silence? Am I just another animal you own? For God's sake, just tell me." Her outburst hung in the air, a raw wound. She expected him to rise, to strike her, to finally reveal the monster she had always feared was lurking beneath the surface. Instead, a flicker of something raw and unguarded passed through his eyes. For the first time, she saw a crack in the iron mask. His own control, stretched taut for so long, seemed to fray. He stood up, but not with menace. He seemed wounded. His voice, when it came, was rougher than she had ever heard it, scraped raw by an emotion she couldn't name. "You think this is about you," he rasped, his words a low growl of pain. "You think you're the only one who had their life stolen from them? The only one who lost something?" He didn't explain. He didn't elaborate. He turned his back on her, a gesture of finality, and walked to the stone hearth. His hand, shaking almost imperceptibly, reached out and picked up the tarnished silver photograph from the mantelpiece. He didn't turn it over. He just held it, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the blank backing. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin a different kind of storm had just broken. The confrontation had ended, but it had solved nothing. It had only deepened the mystery, revealing that her captor was also a captive, haunted by a ghost she could not see. The storm passed in the night, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. In the cabin, the air was different. The violent confrontation had not resolved the tension, but it had changed its nature. The silence that fell between them now was not one of ignorance, but of fragile shared knowledge. They knew now that they were two people in a room full of ghosts. It was Ilara who broke the new silence. As she served their meager breakfast of corn cakes, she asked a simple question. her voice quiet but steady. "What did you lose?" She expected him to retreat back into his fortress, to ignore her question and let it die in the space between them. Instead, he stared down at his plate for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he began to speak. His story didn't come in a flood, but in fragments, pieced together over the course of the day as they worked in the garden, repairing the damage from the storm. He told her about her father. He spoke the name Thomas Vance, not with the anger of a swindled townsman, but with the deep, aching sorrow of a betrayed friend. Years ago, long before redemption, Silas and Thomas had been partners. They were young, chasing the glint of hope in the unforgiving Western territories. They weren't businessmen in suits. They were prospectors with dirt under their fingernails and shared dreams of a better life. Silas's voice took on a distant quality, as if he were watching a scene from another man's life. He described a younger Thomas Vance, not the coward who had fled his debts, but a man full of laughter and grand plans. He painted a picture of two men, one black, one white, united against the harshness of the land, sharing their food, their water, and their belief in a shared future. He told her of the day they found it, a small hidden seam of gold in a nameless canyon. It wasn't a fortune, not enough to make them kings, but it was enough. Enough for two families to build a life, to buy land, to secure a future free from want. They had made a pact, sealed with a handshake and a bottle of cheap whiskey under a canopy of stars. 50-50, Silas said, his voice low, for our families. Later that evening, as twilight softened the edges of the world, he finally walked to the mantelpiece. He picked up the tarnished frame and, after a moment's hesitation, turned it over and handed it to her. The photograph was faded, the edges worn smooth from years of handling. It showed a smiling woman with kind eyes, her arm around a small, serious-looking boy. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice thick, "and my son, Jacob." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far more terrible than Alara had ever imagined. Her father's crime and redemption was just an aftershock. The real earthquake had happened years ago, in a nameless canyon, and its devastation had shaped all of their lives. The photograph felt impossibly heavy in Alara's hands. The faces of the woman and child, strangers she had never known, stared up at her, their faded smiles a testament to a life that should have been. The shame she had felt on the auction block was a pale, shallow thing compared to the abyss that now opened before her. Her entire existence, the comfortable home she grew up in, the books she read, the food she ate, it had all been purchased with the stolen future of this woman and this child. She was the living embodiment of her father's greatest sin. She looked up from the photograph to Silas, who stood watching her, his face a mask of grief worn so long it had become part of his skin. He continued his story, the words coming steadily now, as if a dam had finally broken. After the discovery of the gold, Thomas had returned to a nearby town for supplies. He never came back. Silas waited for weeks, his hopes slowly souring into confusion, then dawning, sickening certainty. He later learned that Thomas had registered the claim solely in his own name, sold it immediately for a lump sum, and vanished. He had taken everything, the gold, the shared dream, the future, and left Silas with nothing but the dust of his betrayal. The story didn't end there. The true cost was measured not in gold, but in lives. Without the money from the claim, Silas struggled. He took whatever work he could find, but it was never enough. His wife, Sarah, contracted a fever that winter. A doctor and medicine might have saved her, but they were luxuries he could not afford. He watched her fade, helpless. "She died in the spring," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion, a landscape scoured by grief. Jacob. He was never strong after that. He missed his mother, wasted away. He was gone before the first snow. He had lost everything. His partner, his fortune, his wife, his son. All that remained was a promise he had made to Sarah as she lay dying. Not a promise of vengeance, but of a strange and personal justice. He had heard years later of a man named Thomas Vance, a respected figure in a town called Redemption. When news reached him that Vance's house of cards had finally collapsed and that his daughter was to be auctioned to pay his debts, it felt like a bitter, circular twist of fate. "He raised you on the money that should have bought medicine for my wife," Silas stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple, terrible fact. He clothed you with the hope that should have been my son's inheritance. When I stood in that square, I wasn't buying a servant. I wasn't buying revenge. I was taking back a life owed to their memory. Alara finally understood. The hard work, the calloused hands, the meager food, the isolation. It wasn't a punishment meant for her. It was a penance. He was forcing her to live the simple, hard-scrabble life that his family had been denied, as if by doing so he could somehow balance the scales of a profoundly unjust universe. She was a ghost in his house, a placeholder for the family he had lost, and he was the keeper of their painful memory. The weight of Silas's story settled over Alara, a shroud of inherited guilt. She looked at her own hands, at the calluses and broken nails, and saw for the first time not the evidence of her servitude, but the faintest outline of a penance she hadn't known she was paying. She grieved for the family in the photograph, for the lives unlived, but she also grieved for the father she thought she knew. The kind, gentle man of her memories was gone, replaced by the ghost of a thief, a man whose weakness had destroyed so many. The knowledge was a poison, but it was also a strange kind of liberation. It severed the last ties to her old life, a life built on a lie. She looked at Silas, and the fear she had harbored for so long was gone, washed away by a tide of profound, aching empathy. He was not her captor. He was a fellow prisoner, chained to a past he could not escape, a man so hollowed out by grief that he had tried to fill the void with a symbol. The emotional climax of her long ordeal did not arrive with a shout, but in the quiet of the following evening. She found him standing near the edge of the property, where two simple wooden crosses stood stark against the twilight sky. The graves of Sarah and Jacob. He had brought them here, or what was left of them, to this lonely place. For a long time she simply stood beside him, sharing the silence. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, a lonely, ancient sound. Finally she spoke, her voice clear and steady in the vast emptiness. "I cannot change what my father did," she began, her words aimed not just at Silas, but at the ghosts between them. "I cannot repay a debt like that. It's not possible." She turned to face him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "But I am not his sin, Silas. I am not a symbol. I am not the ghost of your wife or a stand-in for your son. I am Alara, and my life, for what it's worth, has to be my own." She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between his long-nurtured grief and the truth of her words. She was offering him a choice, a key to the prison he had built for them both. "You can keep me here," she said softly. "You can make me live out their stolen life until we are both old and gray, and nothing will have changed. You will still be alone with your grief. Or you can let me go. You can let them go." It was a plea for his freedom as much as her own. In that moment, under the watchful eyes of the stars, Silas finally broke. The iron control he had maintained for years crumbled. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek, then another. The grief he had held so tightly, the grief that had defined him, poured out of him in a great, shuddering silence. He looked at her, but this time it was different. He wasn't looking at a symbol of his loss. He was seeing her, a woman, standing before him, asking for a future. "Your father," he said, his voice cracking. "He owed me a future." He took a ragged breath. "But keeping you here, it won't bring theirs back. It only steals yours." The morning after was imbued with a quiet clarity. The oppressive weight that had filled the small cabin for weeks had finally lifted, leaving behind a fragile sense of peace. The ghosts had not vanished, but they no longer held dominion over the living. The air was lighter, easier to breathe. Silas, though his eyes were still etched with a profound sorrow, seemed to carry himself differently. The rigid, iron-like posture was gone, replaced by the weariness of a man who had finally laid down an impossibly heavy burden. He met her at the table, not with silence, but with a plan. He laid out a map on the rough-hewn wood. Its surface cracked and faded. He showed her a route to a small but growing settlement 2 days' ride to the east, a place where a woman with her skills could find work, could start anew. He went to a loose stone in the hearth and pulled out a small, heavy box. It held the coins he had not used to buy her, and more besides. He divided the contents into 2 equal piles. He pushed one pile toward her. "This is yours," he said, his voice even. A stake. Go build a life he couldn't. An honest one. The offer was a key, a release, the final unlocking of her cage. Freedom was a dizzying prospect. She stood at the precipice of a new life, the vast, unknown world stretching out before her. She could leave this place of pain and memory behind her forever. She could erase Silas and the story of her father from her life and become someone new. She walked to the cabin door and looked out at the stark, beautiful landscape. She saw the garden she had tended, the windmill turning in the breeze, the two lonely graves on the hill. This place was no longer a prison. It had been her crucible, the place where she had been stripped of her illusions and forged into someone stronger. She looked back at Silas, who stood by the table, watching her, his face a mixture of hope and resignation. He was preparing to be alone again, to return to his solitary vigil. But she saw him now not as an instrument of her father's sin or his own grief, but as a fellow survivor, a man who also deserved a future. She would not be defined by her father's crime, but she also would not be defined by a flight from it. She would build her own life on her own terms, and perhaps she realized it could start right here. She turned back from the door, her decision made. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you stay here with them forever?" He had no answer. "This land, this work, it's hard," she said, thinking aloud. "It's too much for one person." She walked back to the table and looked him squarely in the eye. "Let me stay. Not as your prisoner, not as a penance. As a partner. We can work this land together. We can build something new from the ashes of what we've both lost. Not to repay a debt, but to start a new ledger. For us." A flicker of disbelief, then something akin to hope, ignited in Silas's weary eyes. The idea of a future, a shared one, was a foreign concept he had not allowed himself to consider for a decade. He looked from her determined face to the open door, and then back again. He had offered her a home as a sentence. Now she was offering one back as a promise. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Home," he said, the single word echoing the first one he had spoken to her on that long journey. But this time, it was not a command. It was not a threat. It was an agreement. It was a beginning.